Welcome to episode 10 in series 1 of Away, a podcast for anyone interested in a secular approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. Wow, Happy New Year. I'm recording on January 2nd, 2019, and we're going to jump right into how it works. We just finished up reading the steps and sort of going through the way I reframe them, not only for myself, but for sponsees, believers and not believers. Many of us exclaimed, "What an order! I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. So I do, in fact, like that first paragraph after the steps. And it more or less says everything you need to keep in the front of your mind. It's the next paragraph that is not my favorite and is adding unnecessary information. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. If you were joining a church or a religious order, C might be something you'd say, but it should not be included in AA, at least not any longer in 2019. All 3 of those points make me uncomfortable. That we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. So the pertinent idea is that I'm an alcoholic. When I stop drinking alcohol, when I'm recovered from alcoholism, I am perfectly capable of managing my own life. The thing I was not able to manage was my drinking. As long as I was drinking, life was mostly unmanageable. Not entirely, but mostly unmanageable, and certainly it was unbearable. But once I put down the alcohol, it became relatively easy with time to manage my own life. B, that probably no human power could have relieved my alcoholism. I relieved my alcoholism. I relieved my alcoholism with the help of other people and with the help of a psychiatrist. There was no supernatural, celestial power that came in and relieved me of this. I did the work with the help of other people. And we've already discussed that God could and would if he were sought. I personally refrain from chanting that in meetings with everyone else, not just for reasons of atheism, but in general, the chanting, reciting of lines without giving them any thought in meetings makes me uncomfortable, and I think gives a poor impression of AA as a whole. Being convinced we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood him. Just what do we mean by that, and just what do we do? So reframe it. Being convinced we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our drinking problem over to the group. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Let's rephrase that. The first and most necessary step in many ways is that we believe that self-will alone will not solve our alcoholic problem. Picking up again, Most people try to live by self-propulsion. Each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show. If his arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Skip down a little bit on page 61. What usually happens? The show doesn't come off very well. He begins to think life doesn't treat him right. He decides to exert himself more. He becomes on the next occasion still more demanding or gracious, as the case may be. Still, the play does not suit him. He becomes angry, indignant, self-pitying. What is his basic trouble? Is he not really a self-seeker even when trying to be kind? Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if only he manages well? Is he not, even in his best moments, a producer of confusion rather than harmony? Our actor is self-centered, egocentric, as people like to call it nowadays. This is both a good and a bad analogy. It's good if you are someone who, throughout her drinking career or her life, was very controlling. Some of us were only controlling in certain areas of our life because we felt so out of control in others. Skipping down, page 62. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past, we have made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. So this is a little touchy, because in 2019, I think we can see this as blaming the victim. And in some cases, that is so inappropriate, it's scary. Drinking often made me behave in selfish ways. It certainly made it easier to ignore the needs of others, but that wasn't the root of my problems. I wasn't a self-pitying person, and I wasn't particularly selfish or self-centered in my own story, though I do think this is true for some people. Again, though, from my perspective, this is another example of a defect or a damage with which you may or may not identify. So maybe you were the director. Maybe you weren't. Maybe you were incredibly selfish. Maybe you weren't. Maybe you were self-pitying. Maybe you weren't. Maybe in some instances you were entitled to be those things, or you needed to be those things, and now you don't. Down the page a little. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them, even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. This is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. I couldn't live up to them, my moral and philosophical convictions, because I was drunk, not because I didn't have God. It turned out it was pretty easy to live with dignity and to live by my moral compass, my inner moral compass, when I wasn't staying up for 72 hours, drinking, and doing cocaine. So by taking the alcohol and drugs out of the picture, I cleared up the fog enough to be able to search for and find my moral compass, the goodness within me. I had no trouble aligning with it. And it's my conviction that as long as I don't drink or use again, I will not have trouble accessing and using my moral compass. So, middle of page 63. We were now at step 3. Many of us said to our Maker as we understood him, God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. This could not be more Christian. As we've said over and over, step 3 is as simple as, for us non-believers, or for anyone in the beginning struggling, I am willing to take the suggestions of people in the rooms about how to stay sober. I offer myself to the fellowship to help relieve me of the drinking problem. I will, to the best of my ability, take the suggestions of other members of AA or NA who have achieved sobriety at least longer than I have. I'm willing to let go of some of my old ideas and instead take the suggestions of others who know more than I do. Moving forward to page 64. Therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding and fact-facing process. It is an effort to discover the truth about the stock in trade. One object is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. If the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. So I actually like this, because this is kind of a great analogy for what it is and what we've talked about before. So step 4 is a very simplified form of psychotherapy. Figure out what's wrong, when and why it started, how it affects you, and how it affects others. So we'll hop down to the way it's laid out on page 65. And again, this is one of the better parts of the book in some ways to me. Even though as a woman I can't identify with a lot of these examples, the basic principles are clear, and this is a simple way to do the step. There are also some good worksheets available around the internet for people who crave a lot of structure. I'll say it again, I have found it necessary every time to reframe this. Whether or not it's correct, the word resentment implies anger. But a lot of my sponsees have never allowed themselves to feel real anger. So we have to look at it differently. May have to look at it as sadness or pain instead of resentment. Or look at the word as a resentiment. Do I continually feel the same pain or sadness? I've also found it helpful to reframe the idea of defects, as I've said, as damages. Like a lot of these so-called defects were born of damage and were necessary for a long time to feel safe. Are they still serving that purpose? If not, maybe you can consider letting them go. I think probably the best one that is the least offensive in this example is, I'm resentful at my employer. The cause, unreasonable, unjust, overbearing, threatens to fire me for my drinking, affects my self-esteem and security. So what is that really saying? Why do I feel resentful about those things? because when my employer threatens to fire me, my self-esteem is affected and my security or my financial future is affected, or so I think. So really that's fear. So when you take that apart, you're saying, I'm angry with my employer because I perceive him or her as unreasonable. And his or her admonishments affect my self-esteem. So if you take that apart, you're looking for your role in it. So in this case, the guy's drinking at work. He has a role there. He's behaving badly. Let's continue reading. We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us, and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal, for when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. And with us, to drink is to die. More or less, this is saying that holding on to the anger or sadness caused by someone else doesn't do much for us in the long run, even if the anger is totally deserved. It can eat away at the fabric of life. It will also arrest your growth, so it becomes a hindrance to change. So you'll often hear people say holding on to resentments or anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. In my case, and in the case of many, it's obsessive thinking. It's a constant revisiting of the anger or the sadness that this person has caused. And it may be very real. You may be the victim, 100%. But is it doing anything to hold on to that? Is it helping you to feel better? Is it helping you to do better? So this is where the idea of sort of getting honest, opening up, yes, admitting the areas in which you were wrong, but also saying, I was wronged, I am angry, and I'm going to let that go now. Because it isn't doing anything for me to stay angry. It isn't punishing that other person when I stand in the mirror and obsess about the nasty thing my friend said to me. So now that problem that maybe was created by someone else has become our responsibility because we're the only one being punished, even though it was someone else's mistake. It is really bad to live filled with rage and anger and fear, justified or not. I'm also not sure this applies just to alcoholics. I think this is like a good thing to live by, like letting go to the best of your ability. And that doesn't mean like the minute it happens. It means not rolling around in it, not revisiting the emotion over and over again. And many of us have found that one of the best ways to do that, to end the obsessive thinking, to take the power out of the thought or the anger or the sadness, is to say it out loud to another human being. Page 67 at the top. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, "This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done." Okay, I just need to say that I hate this paragraph. It makes my skin crawl. I don't know exactly why. I understand that the idea here is one of forgiveness, but somehow the wording feels disingenuous. So taking away the part that feels uncomfortable, this is literally what I was just talking about with forgiveness. However you were wronged by someone else, real or perceived, the most important part is to look inward and figure out how you can come to terms with it. Because that other person, A, may not be completely wrong, or B, may never see it, may never apologize, may never change. Do I want to spend the rest of my life angry? Or can I find a way to forgive this person so that I can move on? And that doesn't mean I have to go say to the person, "I forgive you." But I have to let go of the feelings that are hurting me or are hindrances to my overall contentedness. Skipping down the page. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, the employer, and the wife. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. This paragraph for me is yes, 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 yes. It took a while for me to identify, like really identify it in my story. Fear doesn't necessarily look the same in everyone's story. But when I pulled back and really examined not only my mistreatment of others, but of myself, I started to see how many of those decisions, even the ones that seemed bold, were born of fear. My boldness wasn't always boldness. It was self-loathing, and therefore total disregard for my life, fueled by booze and drugs. When I peel away the layers of the bullshit, I see a mess of anxiety and fear that made my life unbearable, and which I used alcohol and drugs to medicate. Not only did they medicate, they made me feel invincible. Until they didn't. Page 68. And then we're done with this chapter. Perhaps there is a better way. We think so, for we are now on a different basis. The basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through us what he can do. We ask him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. At once, we commence to outgrow fear. So now that I'm sober enough to be able to identify some of my more dangerous or difficult patterns, and find the buried good within, I'm also able to start trusting some of my own thoughts and feelings again. Alone? No. I run it by a friend or a sponsor, or if it's a huge decision, I run it by a lot of people. I think about it, I get some clarity. But I'm now able to rely on myself again a lot because I wasn't a bad person. I was a person who did some bad things. So I just reread this, reframe this part as we stop apologizing about our old bad behavior and we become able to rely on ourselves once again. That doesn't happen overnight. That happens by pausing. That happens by responding, not reacting. That happens by seeking the advice of others in new and difficult situations. In my experience, we commence to outgrow fear as we begin to build confidence. And confidence is found mostly through experience. And because in sobriety you're going to have a lot of new experiences or re-experience things as if they were new, and sometimes they will be difficult, it is important to seek the advice and help of others, and it is important to take a minute, get some clarity before making big decisions. It's through all of that, as well as helping others, behaving with dignity, even when you still feel shame or guilt or remorse. It's through all that that you develop real confidence. And with the development of confidence, fear diminishes. That's it for episode 10. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to do it again. And of course, as always, if you're feeling fearful, if you're worried you can't do this, I promise you can, and I promise that together we'll find a way.